This little slideshow is an introduction to Greek tragedy. There will be several terms on here. They will be bold-faced. You might want to take notes during the presentation. Although I will have a PDF file that has the same information posted for you. You will not only have to know what these terms mean, but you will have to apply them to examples from the plays. I'm starting this slideshow with a quotation from Agamemnon, which is the first play in Aeschylus's trilogy, the Aristia, which we will read, because in a way it really summarizes what Greek tragedy and maybe all tragedy is about. The chorus in that play says, "Zeus has led us on to know, the helmsman lays it down as law, that we must suffer into truth." At left is an ancient Roman painting from Pompeii, and it shows the death of Pentheus. This is a scene from Euripides' Bacchae, and this would have been a plaster uncovered as that ancient city that was buried by Mount Vesuvius eruption would have, everything was covered up. But you can see the Maenads, who were followers of Dionysus, and they are in a frenzy. Pentheus is guilty of being impious. He refuses to worship Dionysus because he says he's a new god and he doesn't believe in him. And so, but of course, it's always a really bad thing and unfortunate to offend a god, as you know from your Ovid stories that you've read. And of course, he ends up being torn apart by his own mother and some of his aunts, because they are in a frenzy and they do not realize that it is him. Greek tragedy flourished in the 5th century before the birth of Christ, at about the same time as the wisdom literature of the Hebrews was being written, particularly the books of Ecclesiastes and the book of Job. Like Job, the characters struggle with the problem of human suffering. "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" Job pleads with God as his life is thrust into turmoil and he loses everything, including his health. And like the characters in Greek drama, he suffers into a deeper understanding and acceptance of his humanity and his place in the world. We have the work of 3 great writers from this classical age: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. From the hundreds of plays that were performed, we have only a small sampling of them left. 4 single plays and the trilogy The Aristia by Aeschylus, which we will read in translation, 7 plays by Sophocles, and around 18 by Euripides. Pictured at the left are Greek tragic masks, which were worn during the performances, and we'll get into a little bit more detail about that in future slides. Both Aeschylus and Sophocles were Orthodox writers. That is, in general, they used their dramas to support traditional values, and just as is true up through many ages and in many countries, they were not simply writers, as if it would be possible to be such a thing, but they also served in the military and were very active as part of their cities. Euripides, on the other hand, was a heterodox writer, and that is one who uses work to challenge traditional values, to ask hard questions, to question whether things work out really as they're supposed to, or if the gods' ways are more mysterious than we would like to believe. In Medea, Euripides took one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, a mother's murder of her 2 helpless children, And he used that to establish, if not sympathy for her, at least some consideration within the audience of Athenians of Medea's desperate plight as a foreigner. As a foreigner, she had no legal rights, and she had no real acceptable way of asserting her moral ones. And so, even though the act itself was the act of murder was enacted in a rage and in a kind of madness, Euripides gets us to at least understand that she is acting, but she is also reacting to the horrible way she herself has been treated, and her sense that neither she nor her sons will have any kind of life if her husband puts her away and marries the queen, the princess of Corinth, and abandons them in essence. One of the best preserved ancient theaters, and I wish I had been to this one, but I have not, is at Epidaurus in Greece. The sanctuary of Asclepius, the healer god, at Epidaurus was an important sacred center in both ancient Greek and Roman times, and the site is listed by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. And of course, if you look at the photograph of all these people in modern dress, you see how many people, 12 to 15,000 people, would attend these performances at the Dionysian festival. And you can see that the theater too has been modernized and updated some. There's lighting and other considerations that would not have existed during Greek times or even Roman times later. But plays are still being performed there, and they're still using that space. According to Joe Sachs at St. John's College, because the suffering of the tragic figure displays the boundaries of what is human, every tragedy carries the sense of universality. Oedipus or Antigone or Lear, who's a Shakespeare hero, or Othello is somehow every one of us, only more so. However, as he goes on to point out, there would be little to care about if these universal characters were not also particular. Here's another shot of the theater at Epidaurus, and you get a real sense of the size of it by the two little boys sitting up at the very top. Supposedly the acoustics are so good in that theater that a word whispered on the stage is audible to an audience member on the back row. Keep in mind that tragedy originated in Athens and that the plays were performed during festivals honoring Dionysus that lasted 3 days. Thousands of people watched the plays, which were highly stylized, with actors wearing buskins or shoes that made them unnaturally tall, and they wore elaborate masks like those shown a couple of slides ago. At first, these were probably rituals where a goat was actually sacrificed to Dionysus, and the literal translation of tragedy is goat song. The best tragedies were recognized with prizes and were interspersed with shorter satyr plays and comedies. In the plot of one of the best known of these plays, Estrada by Aristophanes, the women of Athens go on a sex strike, and they refuse to fulfill their obligations to their husbands until the men stop fighting and end the war. The subterfuges of the women to sneak away and renege on their pledge forms the comic situations of the play. Aeschylus is known as the father of tragedy because the Greek dithyramb, which was basically a psalm or a prayer chanted, think probably something like the Homeric hymns, did not really lead to any kind of dramatic action. So what Aeschylus did was he added to the single speaker a second actor. And that, of course, created drama because all of a sudden there is not just soliloquy or a single character speaking, but the interaction of two characters. And we see here, of course, a painting representing Orestes as he is pursued by the Furies following his murder of his mother. And of course, they are goddesses, you remember from the very first of class, they're goddesses of vengeance. And he is in a situation where he was going to face their wrath. We'll talk about that when we study the plays, but he was going to be subject to their wrath, whatever he did. And of course, here they're very frightening women, and you see the three of them, and then you see the knife on the left that he has plunged into his mother's breast. Sophocles then added even more actors, a third, and then of course there is the chorus. And the characters on stage then not only interact with each other, but they interact with a chorus who react to and comment upon the events. The scene on this slide is a very modern adaptation at the London National Theatre of Antigone, and we will, there are a couple of little films where the actors and the director discuss the decisions that they made in filming this. And of course you can see that they are not wearing masks, that the dress that they are wearing is very modern and very contemporary. You may remember too that Dionysus was the son of Zeus and Semele, a daughter of Cadmus. Out of jealousy, Hera, the wife of Zeus, persuaded her to prove her lover's divinity by requesting that he appear in his real person. Well, that was a trick, because Zeus complied, but no human can ever see a god with their full power. And he had promised her that he would do anything she asked him, and then Hera tricked her. And since his power was too great for her, she was blasted with thunderbolts. And it burned her to a crisp, but Zeus saved his son by sewing him up in his thigh and keeping him there until he reached maturity. So he was a twice-born god, again, as you may remember from the Homeric hymns. Dionysus was then conveyed by the god Hermes to be brought up by the Bacchantes, sometimes called the Maenads, the ones who hounded literally and tore him to pieces, Pentheus to death. Now, it might seem strange to think of the god of wine as being the one who would be worshipped to the extent of having these huge 3-day festivals. But wine was really important in the ancient world. Even in Christianity, the first miracle that Jesus performed was at the wedding of Cana, where he turned the water into wine when the wine ran out. And my dad, who was a Baptist preacher, said that you knew it was not actually grape juice because typically a host at a wedding would, everybody would drink the good stuff and then he'd bring out what was left. But that in the people who were drinking the wine said, well, this truly is really great because you have saved the best wine, because of course it's wine that Jesus created for the last. Even the pilgrims, when they were coming over by ship to settle at Plymouth and those places, indicate in their memoirs that beer was a staple. And they didn't drink it to get drunk all the time. Of course, they probably did drink to get drunk some. But it was a way of purifying water, because water was swimming with germs and open sewers ran into rivers. And so water was nasty, and it was associated with cholera and other diseases. And of course, on shipboard, it got really, really skanky. But it is more than that, and it does have to do with Dionysus, with both the intoxication of wine, but also the intoxication of the imagination, which transports human beings from the mundane and the profane and the everyday into another state entirely. And if you think about, for example, the Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, which is a feast day that happens before the first day of Lent, which is a time of atonement, begins with Ash Wednesday, when we remember that we are dust and ashes and start to think about our mortality and our sins. I doubt that the Catholics probably intended Mardi Gras in New Orleans to get to where it is, but there's also this sense that there is a time of joy and celebration and letting one's hair down. But also the Greeks were big believers in balance. And emotion and logic were not at odds with each other, but both gifts that needed to be balanced out. One who is too logical risks being overwhelmed by emotions he cannot understand. As symbolically and literally in the Bacchae, Pentheus, who refuses to recognize Dionysus as a god, is ripped to pieces by his own mother, who is in an ecstatic state and does not recognize him until it's too late. And of course, someone who is too emotional has the potential to not think clearly and to allow chaos to take over the world. Tragic pleasure is, in the last analysis, a matter of acceptance. And I come back to this on a later slide because I think this is so important. We talked about Greek heroes as being heroic because of their prowess, their excellence, and also because they knew what their fate was and they went bravely to face it. In the beginning, tragedy was a form of ritual sacrifice accompanied by a choral ode in honor of Dionysus, the god of fields and vineyards. In his Poetics, Aristotle defined tragedy as follows. It is the imitation of an action, right? We're going to act it out. We're going to imitate what it would be like if these people were really walking around and doing these things. That is serious, and also as having magnitude. It's not just serious, but it's also really, really, really important. If we look at Oedipus Rex, and I'm making this slideshow and video in 2020, which is the year of a worldwide pandemic, that because we have clean water and we have some other things is not as horrible for us as it might be in some third world countries, or as horrible as some plagues and pandemics have been in the past. But what we do is not just important to us, it's also important to other people. And the setup for Oedipus Rex is that Oedipus has some things about himself that he does not know, which can bring him down, destroy his life. But he is encouraged to explore those secrets because his people have come to him and they have said to him, we're dying. We're in the midst of a plague, and you're our king, and we need your help. So you have got to do something. And he goes about trying to figure out why the gods are so angry that his people are dying. And that is the expository part of that play. Aristotle also says that a tragedy is complete in itself. It has language with pleasurable accessories, each kind brought in separately in the parts of the work. In a dramatic, not a narrative form. This is not Homer telling a story. This is a stage with actors performing a story, with incidents that will arouse pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of emotions. Now, we'll unpack all of that a little bit later, but that is basically the definition of tragedy that, with some minor adaptations, later tragedians also followed, especially Shakespeare, when they came to write their great tragedies. Some of the terms that you'll need to know are these. We'll start with ode. An ode is a lyric poem, and it's usually a long lyric poem. Odes have an elaborate stanza structure. They're very formal. And by formal, it means it follows a form. If we were reading an ode, it should have the same meter in each stanza. Odes have a stateliness in tone and style. Often odes are written to glorify a new leader, and sometimes odes are written for funerals, to honor someone who is dead. And this makes them very ceremonious with lofty sentiments and lofty thoughts. And this is the scene from a tragedy that I basically just nicked off the internet. But it's of a performance where the director has decided to use actors that are dressed and wearing masks very much like they would have in ancient Greece, so that their individuality is subsumed under the character that they are portraying. Now, every tragedy has to have a tragic hero. Aristotle defined the tragic hero as an intermediate kind of personage, not preeminently virtuous and just. Now, that doesn't mean he's a bad person, all right? Not preeminently virtuous and just, whose misfortune is brought upon him not by vice and depravity, but some error in judgment. So the hero usually has some position of power or authority. Is usually a person who is looked up to by others, perhaps, but is not a terrible person, but is also not a saint and not a sinner, I guess we'd say. In order for a tragedy to be a tragedy, however, the tragic hero must have some kind of reputation and prosperity, and the reversal of the hero's fortune must always involve some kind of loss. At left is a scene from Oedipus the King. Oedipus, having blinded himself at this point in the play, is comforted by his daughters, Antigone and Ismene. The chorus is a very important part of Greek tragedy. Originally, the chorus was just a group of performers at religious festivals, particularly fertility rites. And of course, we know what choruses are because some of you have probably been in choruses. They sing together, they chant together. Most scholars think that Greek tragedy somehow acquired or grew out of these choral rites. An essential part of tragedy, though, the chorus does have some fairly specific functions, and you will be asked to know what those functions are. First of all, they're actors in the drama who, like other characters, advance the plot. In the Aristia in Agamemnon, the chorus is made up of the men who have remained behind when Agamemnon sailed off to Troy, because either they were too young to go at that point or they were already too old, and so they remained behind. In the second play, The Libation Bearers, the chorus is made up of the Trojan women who were brought back from Troy by Agamemnon as spear prizes and slaves who have lived in the palace for some years. In the third play, the chorus is made up of the Furies. So they usually do have some kind of group sort of identity that makes them a part of what is going on. The old men in the chorus of Agamemnon have a role because they've been terrified. They hate Clytemnestra. They have wanted Agamemnon and all the other men to come back, but they are afraid to state what they really think because they're terrified of her tyranny. Second thing about the chorus, they comment on the action. They connect the action to the source of myths and dramatic themes. Audiences at these tragedies would have known some form of these stories. And so these would not be stories that were completely unfamiliar to them. On the other hand, it always helps sometimes to have a little background information filled in, but not just in a way that gives information, but also helps sort of explain the importance of the myth and the thematic emphasis that the playwright is trying to get across to the audience. Third thing that the chorus do is this: they contribute to the high art by elevating the language into poetry appropriate to the religious and social purpose of the play, and they provide beautiful music and dance. Fourth thing they do, they give voice to the feelings, sometimes shifting or held in suspense by the members of the audience. They are the ones who can speak in some ways for the audience. So as the audience develops an understanding and revises its opinions about the what's held in suspense about the plot or what's going on, oftentimes the chorus voices what the audience, being silent, is unable to. Other terms for the study of Greek tragedy, and at right there is a drawing of the way the stages were set up. You saw earlier photographs of some ancient theaters. So the parados, we get our word parade from this, is the first choral song of the chorus as it enters or as it parades in. The orchestra, if you were to go to a modern musical, you might see an orchestra pit in roughly the same sort of place as it would have been in a Greek theater, because that's the circular space in front of the stage where the chorus danced, and that's number 1 on this diagram. The theatron is the theater itself. That's where the audience sat. The skene was a covered area behind the stage. And again, there's a place where actors exit and enter and where things are hidden that may need to be brought out later. The proscenium is the stage itself. And the timely, which is number 4, was the altar where the sacrifice was burned in offering. And so that, of course, is a reminder that these were religious performances. They were not meant merely for entertainment purposes. The Stezzamon was from the Greek stationary song. This is an ode sung by the chorus in a Greek play after the chorus takes its position in the orchestra. The stazima, which is the plural form, alternated with episodes, and that's on a separate slide, during which dialogue was delivered by other actors. Strophe means turning. Originally the first part of the choral ode in a Greek drama, which the chorus chanted while moving from one side of the stage to the other. Now can you imagine watching these performances with these actors in these very stylized masks who were chanting together these very elaborate poems? The antistrophe, or antistrophe, I guess, counter-turning, was the return movement of the chorus from left to right as well as the choric song accompanying this movement. And Exodus, which means departure, was the last song of the chorus as it, of course, exits. An episode was dialogue scenes between the actors, and of course we still use that word. We watch episodes of television shows which occur within the season. Well, the episodes occur within the play itself. Stachymedia is rapid-fire dialogue between characters that represents theatrically and also creates heightened emotion and conflict. Another term that I think is especially interesting that is associated with Greek tragedy is obscene. And obscene literally means off the scene. We shouldn't be looking at it, okay? Now, perhaps because tragedy was enacted in a sacred setting, the Greeks did not show violence directly, really. What happens is the drama was in the language, but the blood was shed off stage and was reported by another character, usually a messenger who would run in to tell that this awful thing had happened. Now, of course, Shakespeare breaks from that and shows a lot of really violent scenes and sword fights on stage. But the Greeks felt that in some ways that really made the tragedy tackier because their thinking is about the characters and the characters' reaction and these horrible things that are happening around and to the characters and their reaction, not necessarily just trying to fill the stage with blood and gore. In the scene to the right, Antigone tells her sister Ismene of Antigone's plans to bury their brother Polynices in defiance of their uncle Creon's edict. And of course, that's a play that we're going to read within this unit. Peripety comes from Greek peripeteia, or a sudden change. Peripety is a reversal of fortune, but it's always a fall, a reversal from prosperity to ruin. Hamartia is the tragic hero's fatal flaw. And of course, some scholars say it really isn't a flaw at all. The tragic hero is not flawed so much as human, although some of them are pretty flawed, as I think we might argue in Antigone. Aristotle argued, too, that character is fate. Now, we know that even Zeus was, to some degree, constrained by fate. He had power, but things were supposed to work out another way. And for him to interfere in the mortal fate of people was, in a way, to risk order, to risk that the world would descend again in chaos and the gods themselves would start behaving the way they wanted to all the time instead of following some sense of law and order that sort of held the world in check and in balance. But even if fate is inevitable, it still takes the actions of humans to set it into motion. There's a point in the Odyssey where Zeus is aggravated at human beings because he says, they're all the time blaming things on the gods, but then they go and they do these stupid things and they get themselves in all this trouble, and they get themselves in more trouble than we would get them in trouble if they just would leave it alone. But being who we are, human and mortal with incomplete knowledge, we try to control our lives. We try to control our fate. And often we run into the very fate that we had hoped to escape. There's a little folk tale called Appointment in Samara, in which a man runs into death, and he gets the idea that death is coming for him that night. And so he goes to Samara to escape. And then death runs into someone else who says, I saw you talking to my friend, and Death says, well, yeah, I was talking to him, but I was really kind of surprised to see him because I have an appointment with him tonight in Samara. And that seems to be almost a plot summary of the story of Oedipus Rex, uh, who runs headlong into his fate, primarily because he is trying to escape it. And we'll see when we look at those stories. We won't read that whole play, but you will get some sense of what the plot of it, so that Antigone makes more sense to you. Aristotle emphasized the importance of tragedy to Greek religious and political culture, not only by defining the tragic hero, but by examining the emotions tragedy evoked from the audience. And the emotion, of course, that we talked about on an earlier slide, one of the primary emotions is pity. Now, pity can have negative connotations because sometimes we see pity as condescending. How dare you pity me? But Aristotle, I think, means something closer to empathy. Judge no man fortunate, a tragic chorus cautions in one play, until his life is done. We feel pity not because we feel like we're better than others, but because tragedy reminds us in most ways we are the same as. We're just as likely as the tragic hero to fall victim to pride and error, and we're just as likely to be broken by it. Even in its negative sense, however, Aristotle argues, we pity in others what we fear in, and perhaps fear for, ourselves. And the two photographs on the left show a film scene from the Trojan women who were taken as slaves to Greece. And of course, the boy children were murdered so they would not grow up and come back to avenge their fathers. And the women of Troy, of course, are brought low because, having lived in their white-walled city, they see their children's brains bashed against the stones, and they themselves are taken as slaves. Catharsis is the vicarious experience of another's suffering that led to the purging or purification of emotion. Most of us understand the emotional release that happens within communal experience. Worship can be an emotional experience. Mourning is an emotional experience. And I don't know, some people have told me that Grateful Dead concerts are emotional experience. We think of the therapeutic benefits of a good cry sometimes, but this is not just the sentimental weeping. This is a deep encounter with what it means to be human. Edith Hamilton, who is a great popularizer of Greek culture, wrote that deep down, when we search out the reason for our conviction of the transcendent worth of each human being, we know that it is because of the possibility that each human being can suffer so terribly. And if you think about our root of the word fatal, the fatal flaw, the fatal blow, the root word of fatal is fate. Each of us is finite, and we are at the mercy of physics and biology. We could argue, as Hamilton did, quoting Schopenhauer, that in the end, tragedy really is a matter of acceptance. And if we think about acceptance, acceptance was identified by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross as the final stage of grief. This scene is from a modern production of The Libation Bearers in Modern Dress, and Orestes has just killed Clytemnestra, his mother, in this scene. So why then, if you haven't bought in already, why then is Greek tragedy, this art form that's 2,500 years old, still so relevant and so important. Well, one thing that isn't on the slide but is true is that these are very, very beautifully written, very powerful stories. Greek tragedies, though, do continue to exert a lot of influence and have throughout literary history. Greek tragedies heavily influenced the Renaissance revenge plays, and some of those were cheesy, and some, like Hamlet, are works that transcend the blood and gore, and like the great tragedies that have survived here and that we will study, evoke terror, pity, and a sense of our own humanity. Their plots have been reenacted in opera and film, retold in novels and stories, depicted in sculpture and painting, and alluded to in poems. The great French playwright Jean Anouilh found in Creon's tyranny and Antigone's brave resistance an uncanny relevance to the Nazi occupation of France and the fascism of the Third Reich. If anything, his updated Antigone is even darker than Sophocles' original, because at least Sophocles gives his Creon at least some explanation for his behavior, because his Thebes has been through this terrible civil war, and he really is trying to bring law and order, and he really has convinced himself that he has to be really, really strong to sort of get everything back under control. In Jean Anouilh's version, Creon is so manipulative and so cold that he knows exactly what he is doing. And he even tells Antigone how silly she is to even dream that her values and the things that she thinks are important even exist in the real world. Greek tragedy has been used in prisons, having prisoners act out these dramas to think about the kinds of conflicts that they face. They have been used to among soldiers in performances and in discussions to talk about some of the issues that they face. And I have just like these little photographs, one The Healing Power of Greek Tragedy in a U.S. Veterans magazine. Philoctetes, which is about a man who is so miserably sick, the Greeks leave him behind on an island by himself because he won't shut up screaming, and they just literally cannot stand it anymore. And that work has been studied extensively by people associated with physicians and medicine. And there's an important article in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. And Ray Hunter, who is one of our former students, wrote an article about Greek tragedy after taking this class, in which she argued that Trump is the Creon of today and Antigone should rise. And there was quite a little controversial back and forth about that article in the paper. Here is a photograph for an adaptation of the Aristea set in Mosul, where student and professional actors staged the death of Agamemnon outside a bombed-out arts building. And if you want to read about that one, there is a link you can paste into your browser that will take you to the New York Times article that will give you more information. I was fortunate in 2013 to go on a trip, a college trip, and of course these theaters are all over the place. I've never seen the one at Epidaurus, and you can see that these are not nearly as well preserved. At the left, there is the ruins of a theater in the mountains of Delphi, which are so high. It's just, and of course that's where the oracle was. And you think about these people traveling up these steep mountains to go visit the oracle. and worship Apollo, and then of course there is this theater. At the right are the ruins of a theater in Ephesus, Turkey, and it's you can see that they are still in the process, hopefully, of putting it back together a little bit better. Here's another one from that trip. There's the ruins of the Greek theater in Athens, where, of course, tragedy originated. And when you're standing at the Acropolis, you can look down and see the theater and also see the modern city of Athens beyond. Above left is a theater in Italy. These are ruins that have been uncovered in Pompeii. So theater flourished throughout this entire region, and I hope that you will enjoy the plays that we're going to read a little bit more about and read in the course.